Hey, this will be a less complicated video than usual. I just wanted to put pen to paper, well, keyboard to text file, on some ideas I've been thinking about recently. Yeah, I know I promised that the videos are going to come out first, but what can I say? I'm currently addicted to Project Zomboid. November 20th was the Transgender Day of Remembrance, where we're supposed to remember the tragic deaths of trans people. The White House press secretary gave us a hard number of this year's trans victims in the United States.
Today, on Transgender Day of Remembrance, we grieve the 26 transgender Americans who were killed this year. Year after year, we see that these victims are disproportionately Black women and women of color. No one should face violence, live in fear, or be discriminated against simply for being themselves.
Yeah, 26. In a nation of 330 million people, where approximately 1% of them are trans, 26 of them were murder victims. That's a murder rate of 0.00007%. Considering that in 2022, there were approximately 21,000 homicide cases in the States, with that 330 million population, the napkin math comes out to the general murder rate of America being, I think, 0.006%? These are both incredibly tiny, so literally who cares, but trans people do seem to have a much smaller chance of being murdered. Rachel Richards, a conservative trans YouTuber, put out a video titled "Who's Killing Black Transgender Women?" In it, she points out that Black trans women comprise 66% of the 202 cases of fatal violence against trans people in the United States from 2013 to 2020. The article she quotes ties this surge of Black trans victimization to the rise of white supremacy and the far right in America. But Rachel digs up the individual cases and discovers the vast majority of the murderers of these Black trans women are actually Black men. All that being said, the Williams Institute did state that trans people are 4 times more likely than cis people to experience violent victimization, not including murder, like rape, sexual assault, or aggravated assault. The numbers are 86.2 trans victimizations per 1,000 people versus 21.7 cis victimizations. So, is there an epidemic of trans murders in the States? No. But you can certainly make the claim that trans people are more likely to be the victims of other types of crime, especially sexual crime. The statistics for why this is the case aren't exactly clear. If I personally had to guess, it would likely be a combination of multiple factors. 1. Sexual assault and power. Oftentimes, sexual assaulters use positions of power to prey on their victims, whether that be teacher over student, boss over employee, police officer over criminal, or medical professional over patient. Trans people may simply be seen as easy targets due to their marginalization, or they may be fetishized as targets due to their unique sexual status. 2. The majority of sexual violence happens within romantic relationships, and as a general rule, the chance of violence in a relationship goes up the more outside the norm that relationship is. Interracial relationships tend to see a heightened level of violence. Lesbian relationships as well, both sexual and non-sexual violence. It wouldn't surprise me if it were the same with trans people. 3. A disproportionate number of trans women per capita work in sex work, either pornography or prostitution, both of which are jobs that are rife with sexual violence. The Transgender Day of Remembrance is actually less about trans murder victims, despite its official definition, and more about blanket trans deaths. Yes, it was founded in 1999 as a memorial to the deaths of specific Black trans women who were murdered, but definitions shift over time, and looking at how the holiday is colloquially spoken about on social media bears this out. Trans suicide is also far more likely to be a source of trans death than trans violence is. 41% is a meme number for a reason. It comes from a 2012 report called the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, which claimed that 41% of the 6,450 trans people who were interviewed attempted to kill themselves at some point in their lives. Suicide seems to be the greatest risk that the trans population faces, more than violence, which is why most common discussions of the Trans Day of Remembrance quietly slip suicide in with violence. I'm laying all of this out to make a specific point. The moral underpinning of trans activism is primarily in suicide prevention. Here's the logic. Look at this post on the LGBT subreddit that is pretty popular, titled, "For anyone thinking transgender genocide isn't happening, or that it won't be that bad, should the Republicans gain more power?" The trans genocide rhetoric from progressives has been pretty popular. Every move against trans activism is labeled genocidal, and the people who make these claims do believe that a genocide is currently in progress. When pressed on this, they usually refer to the 10 stages of genocide. The 10 stages of genocide is a theory developed by progressive Gregory Stanton, working in genocide studies at George Mason University. He developed the framework after the Rwandan genocide, and it reads as follows. Stage 1, classification. People are divided into them and us. Stage 2, symbolization. When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of pariah groups. Stage 3, discrimination. Laws or cultural power excludes groups from full civil rights. Segregation or apartheid laws, denial of voting rights. Stage 4, dehumanization. One group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of it are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases. Stage 5, organization. Genocide is always organized. Special army units or militias are trained and armed. Stage 6, polarization. Extremists drive the groups apart. Leaders are arrested and murdered. Laws erode fundamental civil rights and liberties. Stage 7, preparation. Mass killing is planned. Victims are identified and separated because of their ethnic or religious identity. Stage 8, persecution, expropriation, forced displacement, ghettos, concentration camps. Stage 9, extermination. It's extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human. Stage 10, denial. The perpetrators deny they've committed any crimes. I can see how this framework can have some use in an academic setting, for example, in the study of actual genocides, which is what Professor Stanton did for his whole career. But nowadays, his framework is misused colloquially for political points. I've seen multiple bread tubers, the biggest being Hassan and Vosh, why does it always have to be those two, who have pushed the idea that according to the official academic definition of genocide, supported by the United Nations, a Stage 4 trans genocide is currently underway. Remember, Stage 4 is dehumanization, the stage where one group denies the humanity of the other group. While it's true that there are absolutely some insane anti-trans people out there denying the humanity of trans people, does that mean it's a genocide? This seems like a wild misuse of the framework in order to score cheap political points. Apply this standard to anything else and you'll see what I mean. Are Trump supporters being genocided? I mean, it's not hard to find progressives dehumanizing them, so I guess we're already on Stage 4, guys. Hell, I'm sure from the Trump supporters' point of view, we're on a Stage 6 genocide, where Trump-supporting groups are being driven apart, leaders are being arrested, including Trump himself, laws are being passed, and judges are handing down rulings restricting the freedoms of Trump supporters. It's obvious that Trump supporters aren't actually being genocided. It's also obvious that trans people aren't actually being genocided either. What's actually going on here is that the word genocide contains a lot of emotional weight, and dishonest people want to harness that weight for political ends. Are non-citizen residents of every liberal country currently experiencing a Stage 3 genocide because they can't vote like citizens can? Is admitting that two different groups exist a Stage 1 genocide because it's us and them? Do socialists want to genocide the bourgeois? Why is this framework suddenly absent in every progressive discussion regarding what Hamas wants to do to Jewish people? Oh, also, when those breadtubers before claimed that the 10 stages were from the UN, that's actually false. The UN Genocide Convention only covers the destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It doesn't cover political groups or what is colloquially known as cultural genocide. This is why, for example, when Germany was denazified, it wasn't genocide. By the way, I'm not saying I agree with the anti-trans laws coming into effect in the United States. A lot of them I don't actually agree with at all. But I'm pointing out something specific here. Let's return to that Reddit post. Genocide doesn't just happen through direct killing. This will cause deaths, and many of them. Just because they aren't lining people up in front of firing squads or gassing groups of people to death doesn't mean they would not be 100% responsible for lives lost. Suicide, fatal hate crimes, discrimination in work and housing, or increased mental health issues causing loss of ability to function or support yourself, sudden and prolonged deaths from stress, grief, and terror. Remember what I said earlier? The moral underpinning of trans activism is primarily in suicide prevention. Even if you don't kill people yourself, if you make their lives so unbearable that they kill themselves, I think it's reasonable to say that you've got blood in your hands. While it's still their choice to kill themselves, and they shouldn't do it, you're not blameless either. Take this, combine it with the fact that trans people are at an elevated risk of suicide, the 41% meme, and you've now laid out the moral foundation for trans activism. The phrase literally killing trans people became a meme after trans activists used it like crazy online, culminating with J.K. Rowling making fun of it. But here's the logic behind it. Suffering from gender dysphoria causes, among many other things, suicidal thoughts. Therefore, alleviating gender dysphoria is preventing suicide. If transitioning alleviates dysphoria, then transitioning prevents suicide. If you prevent dysphoric people from transitioning, then you're creating the conditions for dysphoric people to suffer from suicidal thoughts, literally killing them by forcing on them the conditions that lead them to kill themselves. This effect is so serious, so deadly, that any action that non-trans people commit that might increase dysphoria for a trans person is literally killing them, because more dysphoria means more suicides. That's why we've seen such a huge push towards, for example, the abolition of sex-segregated spaces, because a trans person who is refused into the sex-segregated space of their choice might have their dysphoria increased due to the exclusion. It's why we've seen a massive push for the adoption of progressive morality surrounding pronoun use, declaring your pronouns ahead of time, using specific types of pronouns, punishing those people who don't comply, in order to reduce dysphoria and therefore reduce suicide. You even see extremely weird niche shit, like people removing mirrors from public spaces in order to reduce dysphoria, because trans people might see themselves at a bad angle and notice they don't pass or something. Or the removal of all gendered language, leading to things like people with uteruses, or birthing people, or bonus hole havers, or all that other nonsense. Or demanding that misgendering or dead naming be the equivalent of hurling racial slurs. The urgency underpinning all of this is preventing suicide, preventing death. And if you're a decent person, you should want to prevent suicide, of course. However, if you're a reasonable person, you also recognize that there's a limit to this principle. Here's an example. Let's say I were sexually violated as a child with a cucumber. I wasn't, by the way, but let's assume that it was so traumatic that every time I saw a cucumber, it caused me extreme feelings of distress to the point that I became suicidal every time. Should I be mocked for my issue? Of course not. But should I be able to demand that the entirety of society bend to meet my needs, that all cucumbers be removed from public sale, so that I don't ever have to experience one whenever I go outside? Of course not. We can have sympathy for those with special needs, and we can accommodate them in some ways, but there must be a limit to that accommodation. And this is the core of what I want you to consider today. Special needs is the correct way to discuss trans activism. No, I don't mean that as an insult, though it's kind of funny. The way trans activism positions itself, the way it behaves, is like disability activism. Due to an unfortunate circumstance, there is an identifiable group of people who suffer from a unique medical condition that makes their ability to engage with society harder. We therefore have a moral obligation to secure their rights as individuals wherever possible. For example, when we build a wheelchair ramp going into a store, we recognize that people in wheelchairs can't access that space. There's no reason they shouldn't be able to shop in the store, so we have a moral obligation to equalize access. But we also recognize the limits on this principle. A wheelchair-bound man will never play in the NBA. There can be other sports leagues for wheelchair-bound people to enjoy, but we don't demand the NBA accommodate him. The trans activist demand for access functions in a similar way. When a trans activist says, for example, that trans women should be able to play in women's sports, we can recognize the need for an equality of access that doesn't increase dysphoria and therefore doesn't drive up suicide rates. But we also recognize that the practical advantage that male puberty grants to an athlete is extreme, and unless a trans woman began their transition when puberty began, like at 12 years old or whatever, the integrity of professional level sports is destroyed by allowing trans women to compete in them. Here's the issue though. Because all of the moral urgency that drives trans activism is based in suicide prevention, all of its demands must be fundamentally medical in nature, making it like disability activism. However, unlike disability activism, when you begin that negotiation process of what is reasonable versus unreasonable accommodation, like how it's reasonable to build a ramp to access a store versus it's unreasonable to put a wheelchair-bound man in the NBA, when that negotiation process happens for trans activists stop acting like their activism is like disability activism. They stop talking about their medical needs. Instead, their activism morphs into something very different. Gay rights activism is a type of progressive activism fundamentally different from disability activism. It's not a medical activist movement, it's a lifestyle activist movement. Where disability activists claim that they are different from the norm and need special treatment to be equal, lifestyle activists claim that they're the same as the norm, and treating them differently is therefore unjust. This is the logic behind gay marriage. Gays are just like straights. Why can't they enjoy marriage rights just like the straights do? And fair enough. Even if gay people do tend to get married less now that they've got those rights, should we prevent those gay people who actually do want to get married from doing so? Of course not. The moral underpinning of gay rights activism isn't suicide prevention, the same way it is for trans activism. That's not to say that gay people don't kill themselves at higher rates than straight people, they certainly do. But it's not the focus of gay rights activism. The focus has always been alternative lifestyles are valid and should not be suppressed by the law. To refer back to Haidt's moral foundations, it's a question of liberty and oppression, not care and harm. Lifestyle activist movements don't need to do the same negotiation with larger society that medical activist movements do. There is actually a serious cost to implementing disability rights. Somebody's got to build that ramp. And that cost doesn't exist with gay rights. Securing gay rights is 99% leaving people alone and 1% allowing gay couples to file paperwork that straight couples can already file. When trans activists talk about how serious their work is, when they talk about suffering from dysphoria and the suicide rates, they're making a medical claim. Their activism is like disability activism, where we have a moral obligation to change things to prevent their suffering. But when it comes time to negotiate those changes, understanding that there are other non-trans people whose points of view also need to be considered, the language of the trans activist suddenly shifts. Now it's not about dysphoria and suicides anymore. Now it's like gay activism. Now it's a lifestyle. Who are you to decide what trans people can and can't do? Who are you to judge my life? Who are you to say who is and isn't trans? Anyone can be trans. You don't need dysphoria to be trans. It's all just self-ID. You just are trans like gay people are just gay. You're oppressing us by questioning us. This is the Motte and Bailey of trans activism. Trans activists bring in all of the moral weight of the plight of trans people, the suffering, the suicides, and demand large accommodations equivalent to that plight. But when the costs of that accommodation need to be discussed, they switch track to the language of gay activism, which has a much smaller associated cost. Here's two very clear examples of what I mean. When you talk about banning trans women from women's sports, or from women's bathrooms or locker rooms, trans activism is framed as if it is medical. It's like disability activism. Being trans is an unfortunate, incurable medical condition that needs to be accommodated in order to prevent their suicide. But when you talk about, a hypothetical medical procedure that cures gender dysphoria without transitioning, trans activism is suddenly like gay activism. It's a lifestyle, you bigot. You're trying to cure something that isn't medical at all, but is just an alternative way of living that causes nobody any harm. Trans activists switch between these two positions depending on which interpretation serves them in the moment, but they are mutually exclusive. Either being trans is an alternative way of living that causes no harm and people should be left alone to do it, or it's so incredibly serious that the entirety of society must be changed to accommodate them to prevent further harm. But it can't be both of these things. This is partially why I think the LGB splitting from the T thing is slowly gaining ground. People are recognizing that what is necessary to include people with alternative sexual interests is very different than what is necessary to include people with gender dysphoria, as well as people who don't have dysphoria at all, but claim to be trans anyway. As more and more people have slowly recognized this Motte and Bailey, LGBT acceptance has trended downward for the first time in a long time, mainly due to the T acting as a boat anchor for the rest of it. Trans activists have responded by claiming that people who oppose or question their activism are simply transphobic, bigoted, racist, Trump-voting pieces of shit, that the pushback they receive justifies their radicalism, and they have continued to further dig the hole they find themselves in. When people stopped reacting to being called transphobic, they switched to transgenocider, and even that's become a tired cry now. So I have no idea what they're going to slander people with next. I also have no idea what they're going to say if a real transgenocide actually comes along. Considering they've abused these terms so much, all the moral weight has been stripped from them. What I do know is, many trans people who I've spoken to do not approve of this shit. They don't want to play in women's sports at the professional level. They don't want to walk into a change room and wiggle their cocks at little girls present. They want to take their hormones and have normal careers and spend time with their friends and enter into consensual relationships with other adults and be left alone to enjoy their private lives as their natural inclinations demand, which is a completely reasonable request. They understand they're not the norm, and they want to actually be a part of that social negotiation that allows them to lead a good life in society. It might be the reactionary right wing pushing anti-trans laws right now, and to the extent that those laws are bad, we should oppose them. But it's the trans activists who are actively dumping gasoline on that fire.